All right, so Richard, you're currently completing your PhD at MIT in nuclear science. You also did your undergrad work at MIT in nuclear science, and you were also an editor at the MIT Et Spiritus, which is a journal of Christian thought at MIT. My first question to you is, what's it like to be the poster child of an MIT student?
Well, I'm just very grateful to be here and for the opportunity to think about these issues and to talk about them.
So I think for a lot of people, the idea of nuclear science is very intimidating. It is, I know we mentioned it's not rocket science, but it's dangerously close. And in the book you're mentioning How to Make an Atomic Bomb, I think that actually speaks to kind of the general public's assumption about nuclear science. It's either making nuclear weapons or nuclear power. And that's terrifying to a lot of us. We don't really understand it because it's very complicated science, and it's science that seems like it could go very poorly. Could you talk a little bit about the work you're doing in nuclear science and how that fits into that maybe misconceptions that the public has about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, no, it's definitely one of those things where history shows us that you can do some terrible things with this knowledge. But I think you can also do a lot of good things. So at MIT, it's interesting actually to see how broad nuclear science and engineering is. So at the department, sort of the two main areas of research are, well, really the three main areas of research are nuclear fission, fusion, and nuclear security. So I'll describe what each of those are.
Yeah.
So nuclear fission is, you've probably heard about splitting the atom. So you take heavy metals like uranium and plutonium, you fire neutrons at these atoms, and under certain circumstances you can cause them to split and to release a lot of energy. So that's one way of doing nuclear power, and that's how it's been done for a long time. And I suppose if it's a controlled reaction, then you have a nuclear reactor, and you can produce a constant amount of power, and you can use that energy to produce electricity, and that's the main thing. If it's uncontrolled, then you have a weapon situation where the amount of energy that's being produced by this reactor is growing exponentially, and it's released in a lot of energy, a lot of heat, and so a lot of our work is to make reactors that are safe and that work in a predictable way, and which don't go to the extreme that I just described. And so that's a lot of the work that we do. So
and where does your work fit inside of that at your PhD program?
Yeah, so my work is on this other type of nuclear engineering, which I described, fusion. And so fission, you're splitting the atom, but fusion, you're combining them together. So you take light elements like hydrogen, you heat them up to extremely high temperatures, and they're moving around. So heat really describes how quickly atoms and molecules are vibrating. So if you heat them up to very high temperatures, they're vibrating very quickly. When they collide with each other, they can combine and fuse. And so you go from hydrogen, which has one proton in its nucleus, you go to helium, which has two. And you have different forms of hydrogen that you use. And that process also releases a lot of energy. So you can release energy by splitting heavy atoms, heavy nuclei, or you can release energy by combining them together. And the interesting thing about fusion is it's actually the process that happens in the sun and the stars. So it's interesting.
That's incredible.
Interesting work. Yeah.
This sounds interesting. Feels like a gross understatement. This sounds like the beginning of the plot to like an Avengers movie. I think there's always some sort of like nuclear fission or fusion kind of like product or like orb that is the source of all conflict.
Yes,
So you guys you're creating the source of all conflict. But it also seems like it could be an incredibly sustainable source of energy.
Yes, and so that's one thing about fission which is good. So the way we currently do it is that it doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions.
Let's transition a little bit. I think there's in all of this work, which almost in a lot of ways to, I guess, the layperson sounds almost like science fiction, this idea of like suspending a nuclear, I'm picturing just like a big orb of energy suspended in some very futuristic lab, which kind of sounds like what is happening at MIT.
To an extent,
Yeah.
we're trying.
Okay, yes. But on the other side of your MIT experience, you were writing and editing for a journal of Christian thought, part of this network called the Augustine Collective, which is a national network of journals that are kind of immersed in the deep intellectual Christian tradition, thinking of like Augustine, obviously, and Aquinas, and some of these thinkers who are brilliant men but weren't doing nuclear science. How have you come to see your Christian faith either interacting with your nuclear science or even speaking against? Like, what is that relationship like for you?
So when I don't know if you've ever been on I suppose you have been probably, on the MIT campus.
Yeah.
There's the main courtyard. It's called Killian Court, and that's where the Great Dome, that famous dome,
Right.
is. On the buildings in that courtyard are inscribed on the friezes of those buildings, so up above the columns, the names of a number of famous scientists who discovered various things, or made various things. So you have people like Isaac Newton, people like Benjamin Franklin, who not only did a lot in politics, but also did a lot in science and electricity. You have people like Kepler, who came up with or I should say, didn't invent them, but he sort of discovered the laws of how the planets orbit the sun. And it's amazing when you look at all those names to find how many of those scientists believed in God, and not only that, but were actually thoughtful Christians. And that for me is inspiring, and also I think it definitely gives some context to this question of can a Christian be a scientist, or can a scientist be a Christian?
Right.
Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. And for me, I've really found that to be the case in the work that I've done in the lab. It's amazing when you look at the interactions of atoms or nuclei, and you look at the equations that describe their motion and their interactions. It's amazing how both how sort of complicated it can be, but also how simple and elegant. The fact that we can actually understand these things, even though they may be hard to understand, but we can actually write down some equations, and we can say that from our understanding, from what we've seen, what we've observed in the lab, we can say that this is how the planets revolve around the sun. We can understand why things behave the way that they do. And then with that knowledge, we can make aircraft and spacecraft and cars. We can make phones. It's really quite amazing. For me, it really has proved that verse in Psalm 19 to be true, that the heavens really do declare the glory of God. And I think that I have seen that.
And how has that developed over your time at MIT as you've been immersed in that Christian tradition of thinkers, which you have this kind of belief, the foundational belief, right, that the heavens declare God's majesty, and so as you examine just the complexity, but also the simplicity and elegance of nuclear equations, it's bringing you back to God and to a belief in that. Is there something that your Christian faith either adds or supplements to that process that you found over your course at MIT?
I think a lot of people ask, can a scientist be a Christian? And I think, and as I've described, I think a scientist can be a Christian. I think a Christian can be a scientist. And I've seen this as I've been involved with this Christian journal, the MIT et Spiritus, shifting that question to what does it look like for a Christian to be a scientist? And I think it's a subtly different question, but I think it's an important difference. I've certainly had a few friends who, when they learnt that I was a Christian, they're like, oh, well, I suppose a Christian could be a scientist. You just kind of have to leave your Christianity at the door of the lab when you go in, and you So on Monday through Friday, you're a scientist,
Yeah.
and then Sunday morning you wake up, you become a Christian
Yeah.
when you go to church.
It's a very different day.
Yes, yeah. Life is, these are not separate spheres in
Yeah.
my life. But I found as I've gone on, even as I said, as I study these things in the lab, and I see the glory of God in them, that for me is my faith touching my scientific work directly.
Yeah.
And so for me, I found that these things are not really, they're not just separate compartments of my life, but they are part of the same sphere. How does the gospel come to bear on the work that I do in the lab,
Yeah.
on the interactions that I have with colleagues,
Yeah.
with my friends, with my family? Because I think that if the gospel is to be something which is, which is the truth as it claims to be, then it really ought to have something good to say about every aspect of life. It would be a fairly useless thing if it could only comment on one day a week,
Yes.
or even actually maybe 2 hours of
Right,
each
it's
week.
very poor.
Yes, but if it is the truth, then it really ought to account for everything. When I'm stuck on a very hard problem in the lab, how does the gospel come to bear on all that? I think it's not something that it's perhaps not easy to just sort of come up with answers, but I think that life would be more meaningful, and I think the gospel would really sort of come out in its full glory and in its wholeness if we were to ask ourselves those questions. And so that's what I'd like to see people doing. That's what I'd like to be doing myself.